Marco Polo, His Travels and Adventures, Chapter 6, Part 2. Not far from this palace, in a little valley that descended toward the lake, were a number of small houses where the Khan kept large flocks of partridges. When he went hunting at Cyanganore, he usually carried falcons and hawks with him. And many an exciting day did Marco spend there in the exciting sport of hawking. Sometimes these royal hawking parties comprised an immense number of men, carrying a perfect multitude of hawks and vultures. On more than one occasion, when Marco attended the Khan, as many as 10,000 falconers went along, carrying half the number of falcons. When this army of sportsmen reached the hunting ground, they dispersed themselves by two over a wide space. One of them at one end would let fly his falcon, which would be watched by the others as it receded and flew for its prey, and it with its prey would be caught by the attendant nearest where they came in conflict. Each falcon had a silver label on its feet, on which was engraved its name and that of its owner, and thus, having done its work, it was duly rewarded into the right hands again. The great Khan himself set out on these hawking expeditions in splendid array. He always went with 4 enormous elephants, whose magnificent trappings betrayed the imperial rank of him they bore, and on reaching their hunting ground, he had a square tent of gold cloth and lion's skin erected in a convenient place, from an opening in which he witnessed and took part in the sport. When the game was started up, some of the falconeers, riding to the royal tent, would cry out, "Sire, the birds are passing," whereon the Khan threw open the side of the tent, let fly one of his favorite hawks, and then, throwing himself back upon his luxurious couch, watched the plunges and whirlings of the birds in the air as the falcon swooped on its victims. But exciting as was this sport, that which still more fascinated Marco was the fiercer and more dangerous hunting that he witnessed at Shandu. There the Khan possessed a most imposing menagerie of wild beasts, which he used for attacking the ferocious denizens of his forests. Not far from the palace was a long line of low buildings which, when Marco came to inspect them, proved to be nothing less than enormous cages. On peering within the massive bars, he saw a number of wild animals. There were sleek yellow and black spotted leopards pacing stealthily and watchfully up and down, and now and then, stopping and showing their sharp teeth. There were cunning-looking lynxes with their keen, restless eyes, and in some of the cages were animals, the like of which Marco had never before seen. At first he took them for lions. He had never seen a live lion, it is true, but he had seen the bronze effigies of the lions of St. Mark, which stood near the big cathedral at home, and these animals appeared to resemble them. They were not, however, lions, but tigers, a beast not then known in Europe. Marco gazed with interest, not unmixed with terror, upon these ferocious creatures, with their smooth, striped skins and their savage faces, with which he afterward became familiar in the hunting field. In other cages were stately eagles, sitting solemn and still on their perches, and glaring steadily at their visitor, and in kennels near the cages were many varieties of hunting dogs. Marco was soon to learn that the Khan took the tigers out hunting with him and set them upon stags, wild oxen, wild boars, and wild goats, and that the eagles were used to hunt animals as large as foxes, and even wolves. A fight between an eagle and a wolf was one which aroused him to the most intense excitement. It was with great interest that, one day, he saw the Khan mounted and going to the hunt with a sleek little leopard squatting on the crupper of his horse, apparently as tame and contented as possible. This leopard the Khan employed to run down and kill stags and wild deer. Nothing surprised Marco than the great establishment of dogs kept by the Khan. 2 of his nobles, who were brothers, were the keepers of the dogs, and under them were no less than 10,000 men, who took the dogs to the hunt. These men were divided into 2 corps, one of whom wore yellow costumes, and the other blue. And it was a grand sight to see this numerous and brilliant company set out on a sunny morning with thousands of hounds and mastiffs growling and barking, leaping about, and when let loose, running with the greatest speed, while the trumpets sounded the calls, and the Tartar monarch, mounted on his elephant, advanced in the midst. Besides his hunters, the Khan had many pet dogs of every breed, shape, size, and color that Asia afforded. Some of them had been brought from the far north, from the bleak regions of Siberia, and a few of them were European dogs, such as Marco was already familiar with. These dogs were highly trained, and the Khan and his court were often wont to spend long summer afternoons lolling on couches or stretched upon the lawn, watching their funny antics. Sometimes, when the Khan went a considerable distance from his palace in pursuit of the pleasures of which he was fond, a large number of tents was carried by his numerous attendants, and on reaching a favorable spot, the tents were pitched by some brawling river or on a shaded plain, and thus a canvas city suddenly made its appearance. This camping out of the Tartar court was on a most elaborate scale. For the higher nobles, an enormous tent was spread, in which 1,000 men lodged. The Khan himself had a gorgeous pavilion, sustained by columns of cedar and other perfumed wood, and garnished inside and out by a profusion of lions and tiger skins. At the sides hung ermine and zibeline skins of vast value, elaborately worked with great art and skill. This royal tent, too, was supplied with gilded and painted furniture of the most gaudy description, divans with huge silk-covered cushions, beds into which one sank almost out of sight, lounges and chairs of downy softness, hangings of the heaviest texture and most brilliant colors, enabled the Khan to live in as luxurious comfort in his pleasure camp as at his palace. Around the royal tent were other smaller tents, only less splendid than itself. Some of these were occupied by his ladies, others by his astronomers, doctors and chief hunters, and still others by his dogs and falcons. A strong guard was posted night and day near the royal tent, and in it, every night, were held feasts in which every delicacy of dish or fruit was partaken of, no matter how distant the camp might be from the nearest city. All this was so new and strange to Marco that for the first few months of his stay with the Khan he did nothing but gaze and wonder. He seemed to be in a new world, to have been transported from our globe to some distant planet, where every scene and custom were wholly unfamiliar. The Khan, pleased with his appearance at first, liked Marco more and more as he came to know him better. He indulged the young Venetian in many privileges from which even his own nobles were excluded, learned from him to speak Italian pretty well, and always insisted on his going with the royal party on its expeditions. Marco might roam in the palace or through the hunting grounds as he pleased. The best that the palace afforded was set before him when he dined or supped, and when he went abroad, he could, if he chose, call a guard to attend and protect him. Sometimes Marco, as well as his father and uncle, was admitted to the royal table itself. The first time that he enjoyed this privilege, he saw a sight which deeply impressed him, and at first completely deceived him. No sooner were the Khan and his company fairly seated than the magicians, who were solemn-looking men with long beards and long black robes, rose and waved their wands, whereupon the cups of wine and milk intended for the Khan, and which were on a table apart, moved as of themselves, and placed themselves before the monarch. Marco found that the Tartars, and even the Khan himself, believed that this was done by real magic. But he soon suspected that the cups were moved by mechanical contrivances secretly arranged by the magicians themselves. The magicians of the court, indeed, greatly interested Marco. They often dressed in more splendid costumes than the nobles themselves, and they were not only magicians, but priests. The religious festivals of the Tartars were held very frequently and were attended by much pomp and ceremony. Fireworks, such as Marco had never imagined, were let off at night, and troops of women filled the air with strange, wild songs. The Khan was always very anxious that all due respect should be paid to his idols on their feast days, for the magicians threatened him with all sorts of misfortunes as a result of his neglect to celebrate these occasions and of the wrath of the idols thereat. Besides the magicians, there was a vast number of monks in the vicinity of the imperial hunting grounds, whose monasteries crowded the hills and crags in every vicinity. Some of these monks were married and lived with their families in little huts near the monasteries, but most of them, like the European monks, remained unmarried. They ate nothing but the boiled husks of corn, shaved their heads and beards, wore a very coarse attire, and slept either on rude mats or on the bare ground. Marco was surprised to find an order of men in distant Cathay so nearly resembling the monks of his own country. Marco's first summer in Cathay, amid all these scenes and excitements, passed very rapidly. The month of August was fast drawing to an end, and from what he observed of the movements around him, it was evident that the Tartar court would soon leave Shandu and proceed to the Khan's southern capital. He soon received confirmation of this conjecture, for one day the magicians announced to the Khan that the 28th of August was near, and reminded him that he must be at Kambulu, his capital, on that day to sprinkle the milk of the sacred mares. On asking a young Tartar noble who had been very friendly to him, and of whom he had made quite an intimate companion, what this meant, the former replied, "There is, in the south, a race of sacred mares which are as white as the driven snow. Their milk is also sacred, and must not be drunk by anyone who is not of imperial blood. It is said to preserve life and to impart wisdom. Well, on the 28th of August, the great Khan takes a large quantity of this milk and sprinkles it in the air in every direction. By his doing so, the spirits are able to drink in abundance of the sacred beverage, and in their gratitude to the Khan, they protect him and all things that are dear to him." No sooner had the magicians announced the approach of the time to sprinkle the sacred milk than the Khan gave orders to his court to prepare for their return to Kambulu. All became bustle and confusion in the palace and its neighborhood. It was no small task to get ready for a journey of several hundred miles, and to provide, during its progress, for the luxurious traveling of the monarchs and his vast train of nobles and ladies, and thousands of servants were busy night and day making the necessary preparations. The Khan, meanwhile, enjoyed for the last times the hunting in his grounds, and made the most of the brief interval that remained. At last it was announced that everything had been made ready for departure. Provision trains and guards had started on ahead to post themselves at convenient distances on the route, and after a monster feast, in which all the great people of the court took part, the Khan set out on his tour southward.